Samantha Roy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robbie Samantha Roy. I'm with a startup in the advanced air mobility space called Electro.aero. And it is my honor to moderate a panel for you this afternoon on the topic of manufacturing. This is the last panel before we have concluding remarks from Dr. Tompkins, the DARPA director. And I'll talk a little bit about the world of manufacturing. As you know, Dr. Rankin gave a really good presentation just earlier about exploratory research. But at the end of the day, the value of DARPA's output is ultimately in a product, in a technology, and something that goes to a user that has ultimate impact. And so manufacturing is a very important process. Yes, it is production. Yes, it's quality control. Yes, it's about supply chains. But we like to talk about things in terms of the 3 S's. There is the speed of manufacturing, of taking an idea and rapidly turning into something of value that you can deploy. There's also the element of scalability, which is you take your prototype, you take your idea, and how can you get to a global mass market, or even from a national security perspective, scaling munitions, scaling satellites, scaling many different products. And lastly, there's the element of security, which is really important, whether it's cybersecurity of your enterprise, or it's the security of your supply chain. So all of these many interesting issues really wrap up into there's technology issues, there's policy, legal, regulatory issues, and at the end of the day, the broad DARPA community can't forget about that manufacturing element. One thing before we call our panel on board, just a kind of interesting comment that a friend of mine said yesterday is, this panel better be riveting. Thank you for laughing. Because there may be a fraction of the audience that probably doesn't know that there's still airplanes that are riveted in the manufacturing process. So at any rate, without further ado, let's start introducing our August panel members. First is Dr. Arun Seraphin. So Arun is currently the Deputy Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute of the National Defense Industrial Association. He's had a storied career on the Hill as a Senate Armed Services Committee staffer, as well as worked at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and brings to bear this rich experience from a policy, legal, regulatory perspective, but yet at the same time, he is a PhD from MIT, and so he can really talk in our world of science and technology. Next, we have Dr. Phil White, VP at Moderna, and as you know, Moderna now, unfortunately due to the pandemic, is now a household common name, not only in the US but around the world. And Moderna represents this incredible story of how DARPA engaged early on, and Phil's going to talk about some of the manufacturing challenges when you scale, etc. And last but not least, we have Dr. Prabhakar Patil, who comes from us from the advanced energy sector. Most recently, he was the CEO of LG Chem, which is the advanced battery manufacturing ecosystem under LG. And prior to that, had an illustrious career at the Ford Motor Company, essentially leading and having a pivotal role in electrification and hybridization of their automotive sector. So with this August panel, I'm going to sit down and we're going to have each of them give us 5 minutes from their perspectives on manufacturing, and then we'll go and have a lively conversation up front, as well as informed by you all. Prabhakar, why don't you take it away from now? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Robbie, for the kind introduction, and hello to everyone, although I can't see anybody. But
I know.
As Robbie mentioned, I'm going to be talking from the perspective of batteries, because the lithium-ion battery is going to continue to play a dominant role in the major transformation of our transportation system that's currently underway, and where we lag in spite of being the birthplace for lithium-ion. So it may be useful to sort of see how we got here, to then figure out how we may be able to regain the lead. It started with R&D at Exxon Research and a few other institutions back in the late 70s. But lithium-ion didn't really get that much attention for vehicles until about 2005. In 2010, my LG team, we set up the first gigafactory with a capacity of 1 gigawatt hours in Holland, Michigan. And at that point in time, Korea and Japan were the leaders for manufacturing. China and US were just getting started, and Europe was focused on diesels. But over the next 10 years, the landscape shifted dramatically, with China taking a decisive lead and Europe getting into second place. And China's leap forward was mainly driven by industrial policy that itself came out of the government's strong desire to A, move away from fossil fuels, and B, to dominate in EVs. And there were several reasons for that. One is the huge and growing oil import bill, the health impact of emissions, which was only going to get worse, especially in big cities, and finally getting away from internal combustion engines, where Europe and US had led and would continue to lead. But the incentive structure that came out of that policy jump-started all parts of the battery value chain. For Europe, it was more of an existential crisis coming out of the Dieselgate and the recognition that they were not going to regain their credibility by staying with diesels, and at the same time, the huge success of Tesla, especially in California, which is where the premium European brands make most of their money. And for us, it was our success and leadership in internal combustion engines and fossil fuels that kind of got in the way. But it is not a lost cause, because with the strong commitments that are made now by all the OEMs that are backed up by investments, and the strong role that the government is trying to play through IRA in setting up the charging infrastructure, as well as the incentive schemes that are being put in place, we're in a good position to get caught up by about 24, 25, and perhaps take the lead beyond that. And the OEMs are going about it the smart way in terms of getting caught up, doing it through partnerships, because if you do it on your own, the battery manufacturing has a learning curve of about 4 to 5 years, and it's getting longer because the technology keeps changing in the meantime. As for taking the lead, I think we could look along the dimensions that Robbie just mentioned of scale, speed, and security. And I'm just going to mention what technology and innovation can do in each of these areas at a high level, but then wait for the Q&A to elaborate further. So for scale, we already have the primary driving factor, which is sustained and sustainable industrial demand, because the global demand for lithium-ion batteries is expected to cross, just for light vehicles, 1 terawatt hour by 2024, compared to 290 gigawatt hours last year. But the trick is going to be climbing up on the learning curve quickly, because now we no longer have the luxury of time, and the market is not going to forgive us to learn at their expense. And this is where digital twinning technology could play an important role. For speed, it is using the technology and innovation to fundamentally change some of the manufacturing processes that have been in place for many years, and to remove the associated bottlenecks. The semi-solid technology developed by 24M is a good example, because it replaces the traditional steps of slurry mixing, coating, drying, calendaring, slitting, electrolyte injection with a single-step process of injection. Another slightly less ambitious one is the dry coating that Tesla is trying to pursue. And for supply security, it's using technology to move away from things like cobalt and nickel, and going after high-voltage cathode chemistries that can use locally abundant materials. In parallel, we can pursue things like direct lithium extraction and hydrometallurgical recycling that A, will shift the balance in our favor, and secondly, will also significantly reduce the impact of producing these batteries. So with that, I'm going to stop here and just wait for the Q&A.
Wonderful, Prabhakar. Thank you. Phil?
Sure. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. So thanks very much, everybody, for the invitation. And I'm aware that most people in the audience may not be fully understanding of what happens in pharmaceutical development. So first of all, an explanation of what CMC is. You probably see that in the title. That's chemistry, manufacturing, and controls in my parlance. But really, what I'd like to do is just give you just an overview of what it was like really for us at Moderna, living in the middle of a once-in-a-lifetime events such as a global pandemic, and how collaborations with DARPA and BARDA and other government agencies that actually helped us get to that rapid response. Just to give you a little bit of orientation, we went from the original sequence being made available in early January in 2020 to the first clinical trial in 42 days, which I think is a world record. And I think Dr. Fauci said as much in a number of press conferences at the White House. From there on, we managed to get to our first clinical trial within 2 months, our phase 2 clinical trial in 6 months, and then full emergency use authorization in 11 months, which is unprecedented. From that point on, we're fully into the manufacturing and scale up. And again, just contextually, at Moderna, we had made, prior to the pandemic, a sum total of less than 100,000 doses in the company's history. Last week, the numbers were about 1.4 billion doses that we'd just gone past. So a rapid, explosive, more than exponential increase in manufacturing scale up to meet the demands for a global pandemic. And how did we do that? And we'll talk about it a little bit later on, but obviously early investments in the technology. The mRNA platform didn't just drop out of the sky. There were 10 years of heavy investment from both the company and also from the public sector through DARPA and BARDA in fundamentally understanding the technology, working with the resources at those agencies, working with groups at the National Institutes of Health on antigen design, such that when the pandemic actually hit, we had a very good understanding of our technology. We knew exactly what those critical quality attributes were about our product. We understood the critical processing parameters such that the product could be rapidly scaled and meet the demands. And so, without going into too much more information, again, or too much more detail here prior to the panel discussion being short on time here, again, leveraging that platform understanding, our previous clinical experiences enabled us to move incredibly quickly, and we are still doing it. Even in this last year, we have reacted twice to the evolving viral strain from originally the BA.1 Omicron variant, and then, as you probably all know, and I've just had the vaccine myself, the BA.4/5 variant, which was approved by FDA under emergency use authorization at the end of August. So it was a wild ride, but a fantastic one to be on, I have to say. So with that, I'll make sure I'm mindful of time and hand it on.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Arun?
Thanks, Robbie, and thanks, DARPA, for letting me participate as well, despite my past affiliations. The two previous speakers, I think, point out that the R&D community, private sector, public sector, especially DARPA, can do a lot to accelerate a technology and take advantage of innovation and move it up the TRL food chain. But then to get the technologies deployed or sold, you need other conditions almost perfectly aligned to achieve the goals that you set out early on. And I think in my head, there's sort of three baskets. One is the manufacturability, of course. Second is the regulatory environment, and the third is the market conditions. And and I think in each of those cases, thinking about the world in the commercial sector and thinking about the defense sector that we all think about predominantly here are slightly different. So in the defense sector, the challenges in manufacturability are going to be slightly different. For example, if what you develop is useful and good, then I'm betting that when op tempo increases and contingencies arise, it's even more useful and good. And so we're going to have to think about surge production requirements like you had to at a moment's notice. I think you're going to have to think about the fact that the defense industrial base and the internal organic industrial base just isn't what it used to be. And so depending on it for the production of advanced new technologies isn't always something that should be assumed. I think there's unique challenges to dealing with the Defense Department from an industry perspective, from a program perspective, given in my old job, I would have to defend domestic sourcing requirements, for example, and that totally changes the way you have to think about manufacturability and the supply chains you work with. There's also the fact that the DoD routinely will put something out in the field and leave it there for 80 years, and have to continue to ask its manufacturers to support those things long after they've had any semblance to any kind of commercial connection or market. On the regulatory side, again, defense is a unique place, right? There's the strict testing regime that every product has to go to before it can be deployed. There's the security aspects that Robbie's talking about that are not often based, or not always based actual and technical reality, but are there all the time that everyone has to deal with before they can deploy deploy systems. And then there's an overlay of policy on certain technologies. Anything that DARPA is thinking about in biotech, anything that DARPA is thinking about in autonomous systems is going to have an overlay from the policy community that the technology community needs to really think about. Maybe most difficult is the market, right? If you think about a defense market, you tend to have to think about the defense requirement, capital R requirement, which then allows a program to be created, which then allows money to flow, which then allows you to create this procurement market. Defense is particularly difficult for a disruptive technology to displace legacy technologies and legacy systems, and there's a whole set of companies that are lined up to push back against you as you try to introduce your disruptive new technology. And then, money doesn't flow very quickly in the government. And it doesn't understand the needs for a small company to get early money, to get money to keep itself afloat. So in all of these things, I think then, when you step back and say, a lot of these things are outside the R&D community's control, but I think the R&D community has some responsibility here. One is, you have some responsibility to be thinking about these things as you're maturing your technology and finding those people who have to address those issues and trying to work with them as best you can earlier on. The earlier on, the better. I think in some cases, some of these policy, regulatory, market challenges, manufacturability certainly challenges, lend themselves very directly to R&D efforts, right? DARPA has done great things over the decades in manufacturing, from electronics to the work they did with your company to some early work in batteries as well. And so those are sort of easy to see ways that the tech community can take on some of these challenges. It gets a little more challenging, but I could imagine a world where DARPA makes it easier for policymakers thinking about autonomous systems to understand how they can develop policy which would be comfortable for international law, for treaty requirements in the use of autonomous systems, if DARPA and the R&D community sort of takes the time to talk to them and think about what the next step is. I guess I'll stop and get stuck on the market, which it is very difficult for the government to help create a new market or to send the signal that's believable by the private sector funding sources, by the venture community, that a real government market will exist. In those rare cases where we can, good things can happen. And if we can figure out more ways to do that, I think we could unleash a lot of private sector money, a lot of public-private partnerships to achieve the goals we want at a faster time. And I'm open to ideas on how to do that. So with that, I'll stop. I'm happy to take some questions.
Wonderful. So Arun, great. So really what we're talking about is kind of the innovator's dilemma and the role that really DARPA plays in catalyzing some of this. So it's interesting that when you look at, for instance, the battery sector, you look at the pharmaceutical sector, seemingly very different, industrial sectors. But in the spirit of challenging the broader community, what are some technical challenges that may be in common that that really DARPA and the community have to address? Phil, why don't you say a few things about that, and then Arun, we'll go from Phil to Prabhakar, and then Arun, you can say a few things that on the common level maybe have to be addressed at the regulatory element.
Sure, yeah, of course, and it's an interesting challenge, right? How, what similarities do we have cross industry here? And I think one that strikes me is this idea of platform and being ready ahead of time. Those early investments in technology, whether it be batteries, whether it be a pharmaceutical product or anything else in the defense space, doing that early investment, doing that fundamental, learning, getting that knowledge base around what your product is, and then really being ready together with the right partnerships to invest at the right time to do that rapid scale up. And certainly, as I said in my introduction, and I'm sure it's the same for the other panelists, if we had not had that understanding of the product, if we had not done 6 or 7 toxicology studies prior to that point, if we had not understood how to control our manufacturing processes on a platform basis, that when the need to switch to something very specific, in our case, responding to a SARS-CoV-2 outbreak, we would not have been ready to do that. And so, I guess, again, this idea of early investment and platform understanding and platform readiness is absolutely critical. And I see that certainly as one thread of continuity across the different industries and different technology types.
Interesting. Right. Prabhakar?
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier, the common things is in both cases, these are currently mostly batch processes that we use. And I think the holy grail continues to be to make it into a continuous process. And that's going to facilitate scaling up, adjusting a whole bunch of things. But that's a common thread between the two. And obviously it's going to take different kinds of things to be able to make that happen. But that's one of the areas where it will make a difference in terms of just scalability and therefore getting the cost down.
Sure, and also by extension, sorry if I can jump in, that one of the things we talked about is security, and certainly in the global pandemic, one of the issues that we had was our supply chain, and again, that has parallels across whichever industry you go to. We honestly, believe it or not, we were having shortages in glass. I mean, everybody in the world wanted glass vials to fill their vial into, and so having access to those raw materials and having that as a structured, well thought out supply chain. And again, we had worked through, in Moderna's case, through Operation Warp Speed with the US government to secure through rated orders specific raw materials. But outside of that, the continuity and security of your raw materials supply chain is absolutely critical to scaling up. And I think we talked about that a moment ago, Arun, about that, US-based versus, non-domestic manufacturing and supply chains being very important. And we saw that during the pandemic, that countries were getting very parochial about, not letting vaccine out of the country, let alone raw materials. So I think that's an important aspect which I think all industries share.
Yeah, interesting. Arun, anything to add?
I think commonality between these two sectors and almost all the sectors that we used to see, one was improving supply chain awareness and supply chain awareness of fragility of the supply chain. It was a shock to decision makers how little they knew about the supply chain. I think it was a shock to some of the defense primes how little they knew about where even their supply chain was. And then those disruptions then cascaded up the system. I think the other thing is that for any new system or technology or processes, we've never taken a really hard S&T effort to improve qualification processes, to somehow streamline qualification processes. And maybe there's no magic bullet other than to say the word data over and over again. But I think it's something that's been common and everyone complains about in every different sector. We just never seem to do anything about it.
Right, interesting. So Prabhakar, moving on to another topic, you had mentioned, the term digital twin.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of interesting discussion over the last number of years and, really in the engineering sector. But could you talk a little bit about how far are we away from, when you look across from a DARPA perspective, deep physical knowledge at, so for instance, computational materials engineering, all the way through, for instance, systems dynamics of how you're going to plan and optimize a gigascale factory. And how could you do this all sort of in a virtual environment to really speed up scalability?
I think doing what you just described, it's I don't know whether it's even feasible. Let me just... There is scales in terms of both the dimension, the physical scale. You go from nanometers to meters in one direction, and then from time scale, you're going from nanoseconds to multiples of seconds when it comes to thermal management and so forth. And so if you can just imagine if you tried to do everything from starting with the materials to final, it'd be just humongous in terms of the amount of even the data you would produce. A lot of it would be, somewhat useless, just sorting through all of that. However, I think there is a lot of room for digital twinning in identifying the bottlenecks and then applying that. For example, in the cell design or optimization, when you're trying to figure out the materials that go together, it's a combinatorial explosion you can get into, and that's where doing it digitally can really accelerate the process of optimization. And so I think the important part would be just working with the industry to understand where the pinch points are. For example, right now in the battery manufacturing, the final step is the so-called formation process, where you're trying to form this initial protective layer. but that just takes several days when the batteries are just sitting. And that's something that's ripe for somebody to be able to do that digitally, to try and figure out what can be done to try and simplify or shorten that kind of a process. So I think there are multiple areas, and there are things that are already being done, but those are being done in the factory with the traditional machines to try and figure out how you scale up, because it's still being a batch process. Every time you go to a new level, different rocks show up that you have to try and figure out what to do with. And doing it with actual machines, you're making a lot of scrap in a hurry in the meantime. And so that's where people are trying to do the digital twinning. So I think that needs to continue. But beyond that, there is quite a bit of scope for...
Interesting. So the whole multiple time scales, multiple physical scales, sounds like a DARPA hard problem. Maybe another innovation challenge at some point. So shifting gears, Arun, you...
Sorry, can I...
Please go ahead.
For commercial products, which are being sold, and I'll use the word sustained, is there any way to... Are there ways that the commercial sector is incentivizing the use of digital twins?
Yeah.
And can the government follow that model? What should the government be doing?
I mean, it's really the competition, like I mentioned, when you're trying to get up to speed, quickly to get to this giga scale production, which is almost a necessity for survival, because otherwise the cost would just kill you. And if you try to do it the traditional way, it's going to take you a long time. And so that's what's really driving this digital twin kind of a process in the commercial sector. So I think it's working with those, because there are some things that the industry cannot do because of the time scale that it's working on. But figuring out with some of these bottlenecks, and that could then be sort of taken a look at offline to bring them in.
Great. So shifting gears, Arun, question for you. Since you've really contributed greatly over the years to the successive National Defense Authorization Acts, now you've moved off the hill. Looking back right now, if you were going to add like one new provision to the National Defense Authorization Act, what would that be to help this manufacturing sector?
Yeah, because that was the one.
You're not lobbying now, by the way.
That was the one I didn't do for the last 20 years. It was
That's right.
The one that was actually going to work. It was the
That's
one
right.
I left out. I think I would actually go after this. How does the government at least try to shape markets a little bit? What tools does the government need to send that market signal? Is it a different kind of investment program, not contracts or other transactions, but maybe more creative use of loans or cost sharing with the venture community, or something that can be that early money for those small businesses to then help pull some things into production? Even if DoD can't be the biggest end customer, it can be a very useful first early customer. Yeah. But I don't think they have the tools in place to do that. And so I think I would try to write something along those lines to provide a little more money pull across that transition gap.
Yeah, interesting.
And if I may, that's important in my industry, in pharmaceutical and biotechnology, where there's a lot of good ideas out there. There are a lot of areas for investment and areas where there are specific applications that are in the areas that we've talked about before. But without a partner like DARPA or BARDA or one of those other agencies, those ideas sort of sit and rest until there's a market opportunity becomes available, in which case then there are multiple different players out there, and maybe these guys don't see the light of day. So I think this idea of generating an early market, an early partnership is very important. So I think again that goes cross-functional, cross-industry, and is very important.
Interesting. So Phil, picking up that thread a little bit on the pharmaceutical side. So it's very unfortunate to say, not if there's going to be another pandemic, but when there's going to be another pandemic, global pandemic. What are some sort of technological advances or elements that you think we really should be focusing on now to make the next response even more faster?
Sure, and it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. It's not a question of if, it's when, and obviously we're all looking at flu, but there may well be the next pathogen that comes out from another zoonotic disease that appears that causes us all the same challenges that we've got. I mean, I think we've paved the way with certainly with the mRNA technology, but I'm sure that there are other technologies out there that can that can also fulfill a niche and a need. And obviously, I'm very parochial being at Moderna, thinking that our technology has the answer to a lot of these questions, but there are still challenges with our technology around storage, cold chain supply, and so on, which we are obviously working on. But those technological advances around storage, ease of use, ease of administration, even things like mucosal patches, things like non-needle delivery type systems and so on that will enable a broader and more rapid response to go forward. Another area that I think we've had various different discussions backwards and forwards are more targeted approaches when we start to see an initial outbreak, and Moderna actually has an ongoing collaboration with DARPA at the moment related to miniaturization of the manufacturing processes, such that the idea is that the entire manufacturing and surveillance system fits essentially in the back of a vehicle of a certain size. And then when a pathogen evolves, there's an opportunity to sequence, generate a specific batch related to that, and then potentially ring vaccinate or be on site to give some early vaccination approaches there. So this is a very cool idea, and it seems like many things that are here, almost science fiction, but 18 months ago, we all thought that scaling from 100,000 doses to 1.4 billion doses with a completely unproven technology with a 95% efficacy was science fiction. So that's one big area. One last one as well, I think, which it's not necessarily related to technology, but the regulatory environment is very important, and we have to be careful of that. Getting regulators comfortable with platform approaches. I keep saying this word platform because that's the only real way that you move quickly, but making sure that they're comfortable with the aggregate data sets, the aggregate safety sets that you've got to be able to move quickly, again, was very important to us and will continue to be important.
Wonderful.
Can I ask another question?
Oh, please, absolutely.
So with global awareness of what happened in Operation Warp Speed and global, I guess, understanding that this isn't the last one, with this experience, have you seen a whole lot of new companies get established to position themselves? And have you seen an influx of students into the relevant fields?
Yeah, we've certainly seen a lot of other companies start to come forward, and I don't know whether that's as much related to the commercial opportunity, where there's an opportunity to provide vaccine into the market, and there's certainly that commercial incentive, whether that's driving it or whether it's the human health side of it. So we've certainly seen that. What I think we're also seeing is more on the distributed manufacturing network side, that coming together. So, more smaller units, small operations being established in different countries to be able to shore up that supply chain network ultimately. So, yes and no. We have seen other companies coming in and really start to go in there, but I suspect that's more related to the commercial opportunity than anything else.
Right. So the next, just a couple minutes before we turn to the audience for Q&A, DARPA has been putting emphasis, also not only just on technology, but also on people. So can we say a little bit about the workforce and from a manufacturing perspective? Are universities training the next generation on these topics that are of relevance, or is it on-the-job training that is necessary? Prabhakar, why don't we start with you, for a minute or so, and then turn to Phil. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there is a couple of categories. One is the people that you need, workers for the factories and manufacturing, and that's more of a community college level, the specific training for working with batteries or whatever in terms of safety and working with the machines and so forth. Whereas the other part of it is related to just the cell design, optimization, materials, etc. And by the way, software or algorithms actually, because that's actually one of Tesla's strengths is in algorithms as opposed to battery chemistry. But there too, I think the universities do have the curriculum. It's more of trying to bundle it and to have somewhat of a package so that the students get the relevance of the different pieces and may specialize in one area. But those are the two areas that we could do in the...
Interesting. Phil?
Yeah. Similarly, I think in the pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical industries, we need two distinct skill sets. Clearly, the basic scientific understanding and the deep scientific understanding, but also there needs to be this vocational component to it. So the types of entry-level graduates that we really need and will need over the next 20 years or so are going to be those that have a a strong practical component to whichever course they pursue. So we have had a lot of success where entry-level positions are filled by people who have had for example, a co-op rotation as part of their course, and get some actual real practical skills, and they come to us so that we can then, the training curve is somewhat shallower, and I think that will be an ongoing and consistent need over the future.
Okay, great. Well, questions from the audience are starting to roll in, so let's start to take the first one. So let's see here. This question is that, when you have a defense technology, just a very nascent defense technology, and you need to scale it to operationally relevant levels and still maintain security of that technology, how do you leverage a commercial sector and all the supply chains and the development plants and its scalability? Who would like to take that question?
Yeah.
Phil, you want to take that?
Yeah, I guess we've just been through that. I mean, I think the question here talks to risk, right? It talks to how do you invest at risk. It's about partnerships. I think it's about making sure that there are, particularly for smaller companies like Moderna was a very small company, making sure that there are advanced purchase orders. I think we had a very clear market that was driving. We knew that what we were going to make was going to be sold, but that may not always be the case. So it's the relative comfort with risk and investment at your own company's risk. I'll be perfectly honest, if this had not panned out the way that we had ultimately seen and the clinical data were not quite as good, there was a significant financial risk there to the company because of buying raw materials, securing manufacturing slots at contract manufacturing organizations on take or pay type arrangements. So there's a significant risk associated with it. I don't have a specific answer for it other than, maybe those government partnerships with advanced purchase orders to dampen down that financial risk would certainly help, together with the company's internal resources and relative comfort with taking that risk.
Interesting. Prabhakar, any comments on that front?
Not really, because I think most of the stuff I'm trying to deal with has to be scalable at the commercial level.
At the commercial level, yeah. Right. Because, for instance, like the Army is now very much focused on electrification, hybridization, and it'll still remain as programs evolve how they can leverage all the commercial activity. Right. Yeah, right. Interesting. Okay, so it looks like, Phil, we have another question for you on this topic here. So how and when does one engage a manufacturing partner or a sector early on in a pharmaceutical research program?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I think there are two ways to do this. And if we look at just what happened historically, the Pfizer and the Moderna approach are very different. Pfizer was very much internal. They have their own internal manufacturing capabilities, their own facilities, their own drug product, what we call fill finish, how you put that put the product into the final vial. And so there's maximum operational flexibility there from Pfizer's perspective, together with the size of the company, means that was a relatively, it's still a risk, and a business risk, but it's a relatively small business risk. If it hadn't panned out for those guys, then they have a lot of other products in their pipeline and they're able to mitigate that risk. But for Moderna, this was all, we didn't have any manufacturing capability internally. This all had to be worked through with contract manufacturing organizations in response to a specific need. And I think that's the point is really triggering and timing the investments that you have to meet that need. What we are now doing as a company is making sure that we have better long-term strategic partnerships with certain contract manufacturing organizations, that we are technology transferring ahead of time, making sure that we are aligned, and that we have good terms of commitment in terms of our manufacturing operations. So there are two models there. For the larger organization with an established manufacturing network, it's a lot easier. Mm-hmm. For smaller companies, which I think probably this panel and others are more interested in, there's inherent risk associated with it, but it's how you trigger that, how do you manage the timing of it, and again, coming back to this idea of some kind of safety net there associated with the fiduciary risk that we have there for the.
How often did you think it was not going to happen? And was there a moment when you then realized, oh, this is actually going to happen?
So in terms, it was all contingent on the clinical data. If the clinical data had not panned out the way that it had, then we had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in raw materials, in contracts, and so it was entirely contingent on the clinical data. Now, we'd worked with the technology long enough to know and had this was not our first vaccine. I think by the time we developed this, we'd been through phase 1-2 evaluation of about 7 or 8 programs. So we had a very good inkling that this was going to work. But there's still risk there. We were doing it, but as a company, we felt it was the right thing to do. We had a technology that could help. We knew that we could move quickly, and we felt it was the right thing to do.
Right. So actually, the next question I think I'll give to you, Prabhakar, which is, manufacturing investments are often capital intensive. They're subject to, volatility within the supply chain. And then, when it comes to comparing, hardware versus software, there's usually, tighter margins or lower rate of return or investment, from compared to software plays. So when it comes time to advance manufacturing, how does this compete for the attention for resources from investors?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. I think, in case of batteries, now we're at a stage where the investment community recognizes the potential for growth and scale and the leveraging that they can have. And so I think there has not been, at least from what I've seen as an advisory role when I go talk to even the investor community, there hasn't been a shortage of funds that their people are actually looking for ideas. So it's part of it is just getting to this point. That's when the community understands and sees the potential for growth. If this was the case 10 years ago, you'd be struggling to try and find funding for something related to a battery. So I don't have a good answer, except that in some cases when they see the growth potential, then even for manufacturing advances, there is funding available.
Great. So we have another question for you, Prabhakar. So this is actually a good one. It says, so when, if ever, do you see the energy density of lithium-ion batteries basically becoming on par with the hydrocarbon like gasoline?
Yeah. I wish I had the ability to change physics and chemistry, but I don't. But it depends on where or how you compare them, because with the IC engine, obviously, with the energy contained in the tank, would be very difficult to compete, because Mother Nature figured out how best to concentrate energy. Actually, there is more hydrogen in a gallon of gasoline than there is in a gallon of hydrogen, liquid hydrogen. But anyway, but if you look at it, what goes to the wheels, then you do have some, not matching it, but because the internal combustion engine is stuck with the thermodynamic limit of getting to about 30-35%, and then the other losses that you have in the drivetrain. So you're maybe getting 25% or so, whereas the electric powertrain is inherently more efficient, and that combined with regenerative braking and so forth. So yeah, I think we probably can get to maybe a factor of 3 to 4, but that's about maybe the limit compared to what you can do with the tank of gasoline versus batteries.
Interesting. Okay, here's another question. Let's see here. What do you think is most important to accelerate and scale manufacturing while simultaneously maintaining tight tolerances? So this is a quality control issue. Let's first, Prabhakar, why don't we go at it from your perspective on batteries, and then then Phil, you can say something about from a pharmacy.
And I think there is the traditional way that we've been doing it, which is do it at the lab level, then doing it at the next level, and it may take 2 or 3 steps before you get to the giga scale. And because you run into different issues, as I call it earlier, different rocks show up when you go from one stage to another. And that's where I think this digital twinning kind of capability could play a role. If you could have high fidelity representation or simulation of your manufacturing processes, you can do these what-if kinds of things much faster in the digital world than you could do with the real machines.
Interesting. Bill, we have 1 minute left.
Yeah, and for us, it's really, again, this fundamental understanding of what our critical quality attributes are for our products. And we have this parlance in pharmaceutical development for a number of years. critical quality attributes that impact safety and efficacy of the product, and making sure you know what they are so you can control those with the appropriate critical processing parameters. And that makes the scale up so much easier, so much more effective, whilst maintaining product quality. So knowing what it is, fundamental understanding of your product, enables you to scale the product more effectively.
Final question, I'll turn it to Arun. From your perspective, where you've seen a lot of things from a government perspective, do you think just-in-time, logistics and supply chains, have our perspectives within the Defense Department changed?
It's from a Capitol Hill perspective, there was a lot of consternation and grumpiness about the shift to just-in-time, when it was there was a big feeling that, gee, if we would have just stuck with the old stockpiling system, we would have been in a much better condition right now.
Interesting.
There needs to be some way to merge those two ideas and decide what's important, but then I don't know how you do that. I'm curious what you would say about this.
It may not always be practical, right, stockpiling, because of reagents and components actually expiring and so on. So that presents another challenge of capital investment and losses associated on your P&L, because you bought a lot of material up front.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. Time is up. Great questions from the audience. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists.